Welcome back to my Breaking Ideology series. The first series was 3 parts. That was on capital and capitalism. If you haven't already, follow the link and check it out. Here, I'm going to be going over socialism and communism. To understand what's going on here, it's not completely necessary to go back and watch the first part on capitalism and capital, but it would definitely help. The topics are related and the concepts from those previous parts will be referenced here. Also, if you haven't already, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. What is socialism? Unlike capitalism, where the video had to be broken down into sections, where capitalism or capitalist society was defined first in terms of capital, then capital further defined in a subsequent part to give a full definition of capitalist society, there's no need to do that here. Given that I already defined capitalism and capital, socialism has a simple definition. Socialism can be defined as ideas and views that arose or that arise in general opposition to capital and capitalist society. That is the reason why I made capital and capitalism the first in this series. If you don't first understand capital, you can't understand the opposition. Capital has to be there first and thus be defined for there to be an understanding of socialism and how it arose in opposition. And going back, communism could take on the same definition. So socialism and communism aren't necessarily two separate things. They can carry the same definition and be used interchangeably at times. Historically, the capital relation to whatever extent existed, but it was only through the weakening of more dominant religious and state-oriented social structures in the times of feudalism, aristocracy, chattel slavery, etc., that allowed for the rise of capitalism and subsequently the rise of socialism. For this reason, I thought about first discussing liberalism. However, whereas capital and capitalism are fundamental to the understanding of socialism and communism, liberalism is a little bit less vital to this discussion. Liberalism can and likely will be discussed at a later time, hopefully without any negative impact on understanding of socialism and communism. Liberalism is important because it was liberalism as a movement ideas that developed and opened up society during modern times, usually keyed from around the time of the Enlightenment onward. Liberalism is the ideological backdrop to capitalist society that originally allowed during its development within the context of societies of those times for a counter to those societies and to form the basis of the capitalist framework that developed out of the chasm left in its wake. Socialism can be thought of as analogous to liberalism in this regard, as liberalism developed in previous times against ideas of like divine right to rule, monarchy, aristocracy, as well as controls over laws, speech, religion, philosophy, etc. Socialism developed in capitalist society against the effects of wage labor, poor working conditions, social dysfunction, wars, and so on. Socialism today is usually thought of as an opposition to capitalism, but more specifically in the sense of a relation to capitalism as an economic framework, defined usually in terms of ownership of the means of production, where capitalism is private and socialism social. The bourgeois view is usually some conception about socialism involving state ownership or an attack on individual freedom, which should be, especially if you watch the previous parts on capitalism and capital, increasingly obvious as to why they define it as that. The response of certain leftists is usually one involving an approach denying the fact, one of saying the state-led seizing of property is not socialism, which is true, or that socialism is democratic, which is in a sense true, usually involves a definition of the stance on seizing the means of production, and anyone who disagrees with seizing the means of production is not a real socialist. One problem is that socialism has evolved historically as a broad term. It was a fairly bourgeois term in its adoption as well. Also, with regard to the proper definition, it has to be noted that the social relation of production and not the means of it, that's the substantial factor. Workers can own or control means of production in capitalist society also. This is where historically the term communist has allowed for a deviation to take place from socialism. Whereas socialism was a broad, potentially bourgeois term and movement, Marx and Engels specifically set to define communism further than socialism as a movement specifically to eliminate the social relation that is capital. This also could be stated as eliminating private property. It has to be emphasized here, going back to the analogy of liberalism, that As liberalism was a movement of ideas, not a society itself, socialism and communism within the current bourgeois liberal capitalist societal framework do not indicate a society or a structure of society or economic structure. This goes against the ideas of socialism as a distinct economic system, or communism again as even different one from that, against both socialism as a stage towards communism as well, or communism as popularly labeled as a stateless, classless, moneyless society. With regard to socialism, it's just flat out problematic to say that socialism is a society that stands as a transitory period. There is just no historical or logical basis to do so outside of just the individual's own ideas and arbitrary labeling. With regard to communism, as I've already stated, it can be aptly defined as a movement to abolish capital as a social relation. Saying anything about society further than that has to be done on one's own accord and holds no bearing on the term itself. Although a post-capitalist society could be stateless, classless, this is just referring to the bourgeois class and bourgeois state, which obviously, if capital as a social relation was eliminated, the bourgeois class and state would cease to exist. But it's not to say that a new state wouldn't develop or new class relations wouldn't develop. They might, and that society may or may not bear the term communist. As liberalism gave way to capitalist society, potentially by no fault of its own, or of those who historically could be labeled as champions of what is referred to as liberalism, communism, socialism would only have to make attempts at not making the same mistakes. To someone wrapped in socialist or communist ideology, it may seem simple that liberalism was wrong insofar as it did not see the social relation underlying the emerging society as a problem before it was too late, or they might see that even in certain people seeing the problems with capital, it developed in spite of them seeing that, and now stands as the lone or predominant force that wasn't shifted by liberals during modern times. However, what one needs to stay aware of is the fact of socialism or communism becoming strong themselves as ideologies, and general philosophy being lost as a measure against it. In other words, socialism and communism not being born out of a greater philosophy is what is inherently problematic.